Hi, I'm John Schoenheit from Spirit and Truth Fellowship, and today I want to talk about trust like a mustard seed. Usually in most versions translated faith like a mustard seed, but the Greek word translated faith is the Greek word pistis, very common Greek word, and it simply meant trust. And I think it's easier if you and I relate to it in terms of trust, because what you and I want to do in life is trust God. And Jesus Christ had a lot to say about trusting God, and he used the illustration of the mustard seed because to the world the mustard seed's pretty insignificant. It's very small. But you know what? That old mustard seed has great trust in God. That mustard seed knew its purpose in God's creation. There was no doubt inside that mustard seed of why it was and what it was supposed to do. And what a great illustration that Christ could use for trust. That when people would look at it from a world's perspective and just say, it's so insignificant, it's never going to amount to anything. But the seed itself had such great trust in God and was so successful in its relationship with God, it grows up and fulfills God's purposes. And that's what you and I want to do. We want to mature in the faith and fulfill God's purposes. And in order to do that, we've got to learn to trust God. So let's learn a lesson from the mustard seed. And I will say this, the lesson of the mustard seed gets twisted or watered down by some of the modern English translations that add things they shouldn't add, that confuse the issue. Well, let's go into Matthew chapter 13, where Jesus Christ is talking about the mustard seed. And here's what he says. This is Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 31. I'm reading out of the REV version. He set another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed." And he called it a grain of mustard seed because it was so small, as you'll see in a minute, which a man took and sowed in his field. And people planted mustard just like we plant mustard today because they liked the mustard. Most people today, my grandson loves mustard, for example. And it says, Christ went on, he said, "which indeed is smaller than all other seeds." Now, come on, Jesus isn't talking about all the seeds on the earth. He's talking about the seeds that people plant in their garden to grow their common garden herbs. And he says, but when it's grown, it's greater than the garden plants and becomes a tree so that the birds of heaven come and nest in the branches of it. So here's this little itty bitty nut mustard seed, but boy, it knows its purpose in God's creation, and it has great trust. It has no doubt about what God has created it to do and how it can fulfill God's purposes. So, you put this little itty bitty seed in the ground that you look at and you say, that's not going to amount to much, and it grows into this plant that's taller than all the other garden herbs. And that's the trust that mustard seed had. Now, again, if you and I are going to be successful in our relationship with God, we want to trust God. So let's go to Matthew chapter 17. See Jesus Christ teaching about trust in context, and see how adding words to Scripture confuses the teaching of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 17, starting in verse 14, I'm going to read out of the NIV. When they came to the crowd, this is Jesus with Peter, James, and John coming down from the mountain. They come to a crowd. It says, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water." So here's a boy with seizures that needs help. And then verse 16, the man says, "I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him." Oh boy, the disciples couldn't help this child. Verse 17, Jesus is a little upset. "Oh, unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Jesus rebuked the demon because they bring the boy. This particular disease was caused by a demon. Not all diseases are caused by demons, and not everyone who has a demon has a disease. But in this case, this disease was caused by a demon. It says Jesus rebuked the demon, it came out of the boy, and he was healed from that moment. Boom, done. Demon gone, child healed. Verse 19, then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? You know, the disciples wanted to help people. They loved people. They wanted to be helpful. They came to Jesus. What was wrong with us? How come we couldn't drive it out? And Jesus, verse 20, Jesus replied, and remember, I'm reading out of the NIV here, because you have so little faith. So what was the problem? Why weren't they successful? They didn't have trust in God. They had just a little tiny bit of trust. He said, you have so little faith, so little trust. What would they need to be successful? More trust. Sure. And he says, because you have so little faith, I tell you the truth. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Well, wait a minute. We just learned that the mustard seed was the smallest of all the garden seeds. And the problem that the disciples had was they had small faith. And to get the job done for God, they needed great faith. Sure, if we're going to be successful for God, we need great faith. So if you need great faith to be successful, why is Jesus saying that your faith can be as small as a mustard seed? He's not. He's not. You see, the NIV translators added the words, as small as. If you read this, here's the ESV translation. He says, because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, or the King James Version, faith as a grain of mustard seed. Now, some of the translators and Bible commentators, they look at the mustard seed and say, oh, it's really tiny, so you must have to have faith as small as that. No, that misses the whole point. The mustard seed has great faith, great trust in what it's supposed to do. The mustard seed doesn't doubt its purposes in God. And what is Christ saying? He's saying if you have faith, just like that mustard seed has faith, no doubt, then you're going to be able to move mountains. Absolutely. Let's take a look at what the mustard seed really looks like and why it might have problems if instead of looking at God's purposes for itself, it just looked at its own circumstances. Well, here we have three typical Middle Eastern garden seeds. Walking down the road on the middle of a very nice day, we have Mr. Bean and Mr. Muskmelon seed and Mr. Lentil. And they're walking down the road, and of course Mr. Bean's the biggest, so he sees the furthest, and he sees this little speck out here, and he goes, what's that in the road? And the muskmelon seed goes, I think it's a piece of dirt. But the lentil says, no, I think it's like another seed. And the bean goes, another seed? It's way too small to be another seed. But then the mustard seed speaks up, and he says, I'm a mustard seed. And they all start saying, oh, well, you're not going to amount to much. Look how tiny you are. You couldn't, look at me, says Mr. Muscular Bean. Look how big and powerful I look. And I'm going to amount to great things. But you little tiny speck, what could you amount to? And then when the little speck of a mustard seed speaks up and says, no, I'm going to be great and fulfill God's purposes, wah ha ha ha, laugh the rest of the seeds because they see how tiny he is. And you can see how small the mustard seed is compared to a lentil or a muskmelon or a bean. It's a very small seed. And that's the beauty of Christ's parable, is in the eyes of the world, the little mustard seed couldn't possibly amount to much. Well, I hope you like my little bean story and bean drawing. But the point should be well taken. All of us are going to have people in the world that see something wrong with us. We're too tall, we're too short, we're too uneducated, we're too well educated. Whatever it is that the world's going to pick on. I mean, if you look at the beauty of this illustration with Christ and his apostles, I can see Matthew sitting around by himself going, man, I was a tax collector. I took so much advantage of people. God's never going to work with me. And then Peter saying, oh, I'm an uneducated fisherman. I can't believe he chose me. How's God ever going to work with me? And when Christ is gone, we can all find things about ourselves that would disqualify us from working for God. I mean, God is God. He's the creator of the heavens and the earth. He epitomizes love. He epitomizes holiness. And I don't epitomize either, and I don't expect you to either. But that's where we've got to have trust, like that mustard seed. And not look at our size and not let the world laugh at us because we're small or we're insignificant or we somehow don't measure up in some way, whatever it is. And it's very harmful in the lesson for versions like the NIV to add the word small when it's not in the Greek text and say if you have faith as small as a mustard seed. The mustard seed had great faith. And by the way, in the record in Luke, again, a different record entirely, and the apostles were having problems in getting the work done they needed to get done. In Luke chapter 17, verse 5, the apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. Which again, it takes trust to be successful with God. The apostles came to Jesus, increase our trust in God. And here again, here's the NIV. He replied, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted into the sea, and it will obey you. And you're sitting there, read that, and you go, huh? Wait a minute. They came to Christ to get their trust increased, and he told them all they needed was small faith. That's not what they need to be successful with God. You've got to have great trust, like that mustard seed does, to be successful with God. And again, I'd refer to just a more literal version like the ESV, the English Standard Version. And the Lord said, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted, and it would be. Let's work on our trust in God. When we build our trust in God the same way we build our trust in people. We enter into a relationship with them. First time I meet somebody, I don't necessarily have a lot of trust for them. But over time, that trust builds. As we enter into a relationship with God, as we begin to obey Him, as we begin to pray to Him, as we begin to walk out on His promises and see Him work in our life, our trust in God will increase. And we want to be just like that mustard seed, where it has no doubt about its purpose in God's plan. God bless you.